Hey, thanks so much for joining us. We're excited today. We're going to have a conversation to carry on from the message that Bill brought to us yesterday in our sermon, in our series around emotional health. We're doing a conversation today around grief. And so with me, we have two wonderful people, members of our community. We have Bill Dogterom and Dr. Hector De Los Santos. And in a second, I'm going to have them introduce themselves. But this is a conversation that we felt has been brewing in our community. We've had such challenge over this last year, such a difficult time in our country, such a hard time for so many people in 1,000 ways, let alone this mass pandemic. And we thought it would be appropriate to have a conversation about what does it mean to grieve? What is grief in a time like this, in a world that we live in an era that makes grief very difficult? And so we just want to have a conversation, hopefully give you some very practical and real things that will make it easier for you to journey in community and to go on your own journey of grief and loss and whatever else it might mean for you in this season. But I want to begin. Would you guys just begin by introducing yourself? I know Hector might be new for some of you. Hector's been a part of our community. Would you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why maybe you're on this panel?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Hector De Los Santos. I have my PhD in clinical psychology. Got it from Purdue University. And now I'm working as a psychologist. Was at the VA in Long Beach for the last couple of years and have been at the Garden for the last 3 years. So I'm really excited about the opportunity to have this conversation just because grief is something that I encounter a lot and something that can be hard to engage with, something that's going to be hard to sort of wrap our heads around. And also, as Bill sort of shared, when we engage in it, there's also a lot of opportunity for growth.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I can imagine this will be many conversations we get to have with you over the coming season as someone a part of our community. Bill, you've been around the community since the very beginning. You've had a lot of experience pastorally and personally over the years. Anything you want to say as we begin?
No, just that this conversation, I think what Hector just shared is something I've had to learn into through my own losses and things getting cracked open in my own life.
Yeah. And
then pastoring for 45 years and working with students in campus pastor roles and then teaching. It's an ongoing conversation, especially when you broaden it out past the typical understanding of grief being how you experience the loss of a loved one or something like that. Actually, the idea is much broader than that. Yeah. So lots of times to talk about it.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that, kind of the different dynamics and practical realities of it. I do want to know as we begin, if you haven't already listened to the message that Bill preached just this past weekend in our series on emotionally healthy spirituality, we really want to encourage you. This is not an additional, you don't have to watch that to understand this, but I think Bill did a tremendous job of setting our community up for what it means to be people who expect grief and to be in a faith that honors the process inherently built into what it means to be a person in the world, a broken world of all places. And I just thought it was an incredible message. And this isn't like an addendum, this isn't additional, but we just feel like today we're going to get into some of the practicals of it. And as you begin already, I just think let's start there. What's our working definition of grief for our conversation today? Maybe you can begin, Hector. What does it mean to be in grief or to grieve?
Sure. So I think being in grief in part is this idea of experiencing loss. And we can sort of be sometimes myopic, sort of really focused on loss, meaning someone passing away, but loss can be a variety of different things. It can be loss of ability, loss of a loved one, loss of opportunity, loss of expectations. And so it's that emotional experience, and it's sort of grieving is being able to enter into that experience of loss without running away from it, being able to engage with it, being able to engage with this experience of maybe things not going the way that we wish that they would, or the way that we hope that they would.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a starting definition.
Yeah, I don't really have anything. For me, I just think that grief is the gift that God has given us to process being human.
Yeah.
That we are going to experience losses, and how do we honor the value of what we're losing?
Yeah.
And grief is the primary way I think that we're intended to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you, when you tell someone to grieve, right? I've learned, I think, from you over the years that the only wrong way to grieve is to not do it.
Right.
That's embedded in me, and it's been such a gift to have that framed. But practically, if you're in a conversation, or if I'm in a relationship with someone who's experiencing loss and is really at attention because they haven't learned, because of their family, because of our culture, what it means to grieve or to grieve well, how do you say, when you say you have to grieve, how do you invite, what's the first step? What's the first step of how do I begin to dip my toes into this and not just avoid it, right? Which is one of the clear spectrums of what we can do, is just numb out, avoid this deep pain, and move on to hopeful Pollyanna optimism, or to the Job response. You have people explain it away, or to not know how to deal with it and just make it righteous. What's the first step?
I think, and a lot of it is the first step is making space. And this is something that we've talked about, I think, throughout emotionally healthy spirituality and in general, this idea of space, solitude. I think in that space, allowing for the opportunity to sort of self-reflect and say, hey, what's actually going on internally for me? How am I feeling? And being able to take some time to recognize what might I have lost? And engaging with that. So that can look, when we say make space, what does that mean? Does that mean like I'm going to watch the first 15 minutes of Up and just start bawling? Does that mean I'm going to listen to a really sad song? I think really it can mean spending time talking with God and sort of asking, hey, can you open this up for me? It can be journaling, it can be video journaling, but just allowing yourself to sort of be retrospective, make space, and begin to understand what might I be feeling like I'm missing right now. And I think that might be sort of the first step into being able to sort of begin to grieve. And in a sense, I think like the idea of sitting Shiva, which is this sort of Jewish tradition after loss to sort of mourn for 7 days, where you just have time. You're not expected to do very much. You're not expected to go out. You're not expected to X, Y, or Z. That tradition might be one that we can learn from in terms of being able to slow down and make space.
Yeah.
And I think to legitimize sadness as an appropriate emotion.
Yeah.
Where, the Western world, I think sitting Shiva, virtually every other culture in the world has got a way of saying goodbye to loved ones. Preparation of the body for burial, and participation in the celebration of life after, all of those things. And we go right to, okay, let's get this done and move on to and as a result of that, the deep work of saying goodbye and honoring the life lived, et cetera, just never gets done. So I think and the reason I think we don't sadness makes us feel weak and vulnerable. And the truth, of course, is we are weak and vulnerable in the face of an empty grave. It's just, there's a hole in the ground, and whether it's a person or a dream or a job or a relationship that is going, and it's not coming back out. Right? It's a turn in the road. And so to let that happen, I think is for me the first, because the soul is built to grieve. And it knows how to do it. And our problem is that we don't like how it does it, and we want to get in there and kind of monkey with it. And because that's, I think your expertise would be helpful here, but I think everybody grieves differently. So for some of us, it sneaks up on us when we're sitting at a stoplight. And others of us, it's when we watch the movie or listen to the thing. my general rubric, as you know, is what I said the other day, is feel what you feel when you feel it. Don't try and undermine. If you've got permission in your place of employment or with your family to cry and you feel like crying, cry. If you don't, maybe step out of the meeting. Or if you can't, try and get back in touch with that feeling later on in the day when you have a bit of space to enter into it. Because the soul will bring things up until they're dealt with in some reasonable way.
Or they will come out in really
It's going to come out now, because when we aren't giving ourselves permission to feel sad, it tends to come out sideways in anger.
Yeah, I think that's so good in terms of there's this piece that is, again, maybe just part of our culture, maybe it's just part of human nature, is that like when you're grieving, crying doesn't feel that fun. Feeling tired doesn't feel that fun. Feeling senses of hopeless doesn't feel that fun. And feeling that for any period of time doesn't feel that fun. So I think the piece that you're describing, that like there is a kind of interesting temporality that's different for each person. It may be that you may feel like, this is something my wife and I often talk about. She'll be like, I grieved it, we're good. And then a week later, she feels sad again. And instead of feeling sad, I do the same thing. Instead of feeling sad, we make ourselves busy. We have this should that sort of comes up of, well, I should be done. I shouldn't have to be crying at work. I shouldn't be crying at this movie or show. And so I think a piece of what you said, allow yourself to experience grief, to experience sadness when it comes up without really having to judge it, is such an important piece of that.
Well, and then that also legitimizes other feelings under the covering of grief, right? That you can grieve with laughter. You can grieve with a poignant memory of a loved one, and it's not dishonoring to the loss to laugh out loud or to engage in some of the other aspects of it. And then the other piece, just if I can, grief tends to link with other losses. So a loss that I might be experiencing of a loved one might very well trigger some other losses that I've experienced. Or here, somebody I loved and cared for deeply, a family member, whatever, passes away, dies, and we go through the rituals and we manage it as well as we can, but then 6 months later a pet dies. And for all outward appearance, the response to the pet dying is more extreme than the response to the loved one dying. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that loss is uncovering the pockets of loss from the previous one that hadn't had a chance maybe to get uncovered and dealt with.
How do you begin to pull apart and separate the iceberg that's beneath it? I mean, we live in, what we have discovered is one of the most traumatized countries in the world. Some of the research coming out around,
Well,
all
can
those
I
things.
tweak that just a
Please,
tad?
I want to hear.
Yes, but we're not being bombed. We're not
totally
experiencing the trauma of famine. So part of what we're dealing with is, I want to be careful here, but I think we have become as a culture traumatized as a way of managing the slightest of inconveniences. And because we don't know how to respond to losses of virtually any kind, because there are, you're exactly right, but there are people going through horrific things elsewhere in the world, but whose system has trained them over time to deal with those in ways that our system, somebody cuts me off on the 405 freeway, and it's like I'm out to lunch for hours.
I do. I think there's you said it in your message, the idea of catastrophizing, where we've so tuned in suspiciously to anyone who could be offense becomes actual violence, and everything becomes catastrophized, to use that word, which basically just means, like you've said, I think you may have even defined it as something to take an event and make it larger or more significant or intense than the actual event demands. But I mean, long conversation, but trauma really has to do with how the brain stores it and how it's experienced rather than what the significance on a scale of, mass genocide versus cut off on the freeway. I do think there's a tension there. I think we have misidentified conflict and abuse in a lot of ways, and we've tend to merge those into a single entity, and that's, I think, what you're talking about. Yeah. But I mean, even practically what I'm getting at, I think you were getting here too, is how do we pull apart the pieces to know what I'm actually experiencing? And is it important? Is it important to know that, oh, I yelled at the dog because really I'm grieving the loss of my parent? How important is that, and how do we begin to even process that as you've experienced it even?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of two parts there. I think one part, in a sense, is something that we've talked about the past couple of weeks in church, but this idea of you can't, in a sense, we have to allow God into the spaces for him to touch us. And so some of that suggests that it's helpful to know why I'm yelling at the dog. Yeah. Or else, like, I can't really surrender that to God. I can't really process that. I can't really allow anything to touch that. And so being able to recognize why is this coming up for me? And I think that's an important aspect of, I think it's a super important aspect of grieving. Like, is what I'm experiencing, am I experiencing sort of the degree of grief that I'm experiencing because I'm feeling like my life is over? Yeah. When in reality, the loss is that, we had an ectopic pregnancy and miscarriage last year. Really, the loss is we had hoped to meet this baby, and we were excited about the prospect of being parents. And that's the loss that we have to sort of get into and grieve, but we maybe never even get there if we're really focused on our life is over, we're never going to be able to have kids. And so it's certainly tough to parse. I think some of it requires taking the time to say, well, sometimes it's writing down, sometimes it's talking, sometimes it's how community can be super helpful to be able to say, hey, what is actually the loss here? I know that there's loss somewhere in here, but what's actually the thing? And being in tune with ourselves and having friends that can speak into us make that a bit easier. But we also often just choose not to find the time to do so.
But I think, Hector, that is the point you started us out with is critical, right? And that is the creation of space for exactly that invitation. Holy Spirit, search my heart. What is going on, right? And sometimes the gift of the Spirit is a brother that says, dude, what's up with you, right? Something's going sideways here, or a spouse will make your and then how I respond to that. But because we are such relentlessly self-protective and defensive, we need to deliberately, with intention, and that's where this whole series is so helpful for me, is that it's saying, slow down. You've got to show up in your own life, and you're moving so fast, you're not even where you are to feel what you feel, because that was yesterday. And so the space, I think that for me that's money right there, is stop and consider, sink down below the surface for just a minute and invite the Spirit to search, what's going on. Because I'm not altogether sure that without that we'll ever be able to parse out what needs to be parsed out. I think it's just a tangled mess often in there. And if I get too particular about it, I'm gonna pull on a string and I'll miss so much else. All kinds of
and that's, we could even get into that. I mean, we could even say that's the the difference of the psychological,
Right.
like philosophical, right, Freudian mindset. That's like not helpful for us. We're doing this as disciples, saying we want the lens that frees us up into mature and healthy discipleship. But we don't have to assume that there's a monster under every rock, or there's,
Right.
like you said, don't have to pull it apart at every thread.
Right.
The psychologist James Hillman has this really thoughtful line where he says that a symptom suffers most when it doesn't know where it belongs. And that idea of just sitting with, having the need to sit, this is where categories can sometimes be really freeing for some people, like learning the stages of grief, which we can talk through, I think. Like for me, those have been helpful in times, to just name it. To name something is to free you from its dominance, right? As Rollhauser writes. I think that's helpful for me to go, oh, that's why I'm so angry right now, And that's expected. People have done this for a long time. People have been grieving for a long time. I'm not alone in my journey. I'm in a community of people who've lost. We've all experienced loss. And also there's wisdom to be garnered from the people who've come before me. You talked about Shiva. I think, even the Deuteronomy limits the excess of grief, but also requires to go through it. And there's something so beautiful in that we live in a culture where those are the two tendencies. We either avoid it to avoid the difficulty, and we spend zero time, and maybe this is where a helpful even comment from you guys, the two tendencies are to overindulge and to linger so long that grief becomes who you are, an over-identification, and there's no healing because we grieve without hope, right? Despair maybe is a better word for it. To grieve without hope is despair, and that's not our calling to do. Or to avoid it, maybe even out of a biblical sense of denying the pain of loss, because whatever reason, maybe it's a family system that hasn't allowed you to grieve, maybe it's a personal experience where it's too painful. But I think the Bible tends to honor the dead, but not at the cost of the living. To say you have to do that so much that your life is now defined by their death. But you will not have a life if you don't honor that this was a limit, a death. And what is that? I feel like those are the two wings. And I don't know if you, as you have walked and pastored and walked clinically with people, what are the tools you've given to help people, okay, you need to engage the pain of this. And also, okay, you need to limit the excess of indulgence in the pain of this. Does that make sense? Is that too strong to say?
No, I don't think so. For me, the other half of the feel what you feel when you feel it is don't feel what you don't feel when you don't feel it.
Yes, yeah.
So that there is the soul. I keep coming back to this, but it's genius. It's really good and the problem is that we want to control rather than be along for the ride of grief. We want to metricize it. We want, okay, am I done now? Rather than riding the roller coaster and what I think you discover, as we talked about even before we started, how it becomes episodic. You deal with stuff to begin with, and you think, okay, I'm starting to feel, the color's starting to come back in the day. I feel a little bit of and then 3 weeks later, you smell perfume. Or you see a profile across a hallway, and you're right back in. That's how the soul deals with it. The challenge is that grief is really exhausting. It's hard work, and we can't do it all at once so that we're over and done. It has to be, especially profound losses, in my view, have to be incremental. That there's a cycle to it, that kind of the deep is less deep over time, but it's still there. And again, the soul is really good at this as long as we don't get in there with our steering wheel and try and manage. It's like the guys in Autopia. It's not connected to anything.
I think that's a really significant piece, Bill. You said it just now, that grief taps at the realization that we are not in control. And so when we try to steer grief as if we are in control, we are automatically missing the lesson that's on the surface. this is not yours to own. That person, that loss, it's out of your control by default. And the sooner that you can open your hands to that, the sooner you can begin to live in a world that's real, live in a healthy reality. You said it yesterday, life is hard, life sucks, and then you die. Or something similar to that, which is a thing our culture does really poorly.
Yeah.
Life is great, and will get better, and you're in control. And you may not have to die, live on in whatever means that you think you can. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're like, man, mine's jumping in lots of different directions.
Yeah.
I think there is an aspect that happens with grief or with loss where our preconceived notions are challenged. Yeah. So maybe I thought in a way that I was in control, or maybe I even had a sort of inappropriate view of what God's goodness or providence meant.
Yes.
And so then when loss happens,
that's good.
It blows up this idea.
Yes.
Right. And so we sometimes we continue to hold on to the idea and try to figure out there's got to be something else. Sometimes we let go of the idea completely. And we go from one side to the complete other. I guess God's not good. I guess God's not actually in control of anything.
Yeah.
Or I thought I was in control of these things. Now I'm completely out of control.
Right. Yeah.
Or maybe we had more challenging beliefs. Things like, man, I deserve the harm that comes to me. Or good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And so then we experience loss, but we hold really tight to this belief. So now we're searching for what reason did this happen? How is this sort of diving into shame in a sense instead of grieving, because we're trying to figure out what about me sort of led to this. So those things can sometimes be, in a sense, what ends up being a little bit of the driving wheel that drives us sort of off from grief. I think so that's one thought. I think another thing that I was thinking about as we were preparing for this is just this idea that like grief without context is devastating. Because grief without context, we just sort of sit in grief, we're lost. It can feel like a pit that never ends.
Yeah.
And in reality, if we grieve well, which we're still sort of figuring out, sort of talking about what exactly that looks like, what feels incredibly painful over time will begin to just feel tender.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the process that we get into. But when it feels really painful, we just sometimes jump out. We sometimes say, oh, this is a little bit too much. I think the context for us, I think some of the gift that we have is it's within this broader context of who is Jesus and who is God, and what's our relationship with him in the midst of this. I was listening. I have to shout out the podcast. It's called Bema, and the guy that leads is Marty Solomon. He was doing this talk on Lamentations, and so sort of talking about Lamentations, and Lamentations is sort of the first 2 chapters are 22 verses, the last 2 are 22 verses, 5 chapters, and the middle one's 66. And right in the middle of it, Lamentations all about lament. I know, surprising, but right in the middle of this lament is a reminder of hope, and so we see even in the Bible there's this whole book that's just about lamenting and grieving and the importance of grieving, and they're grieving sort of the sadness of this, the way in which they've sort of fallen away from who God is, and in the middle of this there's this reminder, and yet I have hope. And the reason that I have hope is because of who God is. And so the grief is still sort of contextualized within who God is. And that's a struggle, but it's a dialectic. It's this tension that we hold between being able to grieve and also being able to maintain context.
I stumbled upon this. I'm one who's drawn, especially in moments where the scientific propositional statements aren't helpful. Grief is one of those moments where I find a song or a poem tend to just be my, I'll say it personally, when my parents divorced when I was a teenager, that was the first real loss or grief that I had experienced. I had lost grandparents and I had lost friends. And it wasn't until I was a lot older that I realized how loss had become really normative. My home, my mom has an incredible gift of welcoming people in the later stages of their life, the final stages of their life, into our home. And so we grew up with people whose final months and weeks were spent living in our home as hospice. And I didn't realize how peculiar that was, or even that was, until I was much older. And I realized how, for me, loss and death was as much a part of my life as anything. And I realized how foreign that was. Especially to, I have so many people, friends who are in their mid-30s who've never truly lost anyone, grandparent, friend. And I couldn't list all the friends who were my age at different points who had passed away. But I stumbled upon this years ago. I've never read the book, but Arthur Golden wrote Memoirs of a Geisha. And this was the most profound description I've heard to the point of what you said. And to me, it speaks really well. He says, "Grief is a most peculiar thing. We're so helpless in the face of it. It's like a window that's simply open of its own accord. The room grows cold and we can do nothing but shiver. But it opens a little less each time and a little less. And one day we wonder what has become of it." And I feel like there's something about that. You just have to walk and sit in it with your hands open. And it's not a frenzied activity. It's not and I think there's something about that our culture does so poorly. I do so poorly. Even someone who's more accustomed maybe to grief than other people who were brought up in my time or age. And as you said, in a world where we might be involved with wars, but we're not war-torn, where death isn't at our door in the way that it is for people of every generation past. I just think there's something to that. When you have, maybe in your experience, how have you seen, maybe if you even have a memory of someone you've worked with or cared for who has grieved well, that you learned from them? I just think there's something to that that's helpful, giving a picture. Does anyone come to mind?
Oh man, pastoring over the years that I have, we're at lots of
so many
funerals,
people.
The easiest, if I can really be blunt, the easiest people to grieve are those who have lived a long and productive and much loved life. And they ride off into the sunset at 75, 80, 85, 90, 100 years of age, and it's like, the hardest are those who have things left to do. A parent burying a child is that for me has always been the most difficult group. I've walked with enough of those to have the realization that grieving well when your 2-year-old drowns in the swimming pool looks different. Right? And that is, you're discombobulated. You're completely flummoxed for a while. You're not good for anything. Give yourself permission to be there. Your soul will start to signal when it's time to come back, and then it'll take you back there as you need to periodically. So I think grieving well, like we've said before, is just to do it, get your hands out of the gears and give yourself that space and that permission and ruthlessly contend for the opportunity to lean into life as it is and isn't along the way. Because I've watched folks who have lost lifetime partners. And they were a mess for a month, 2 months. And then you could gradually see the humor return, and you could gradually see okay, it's time to clean out the garage now. It's time to, so there, right? And I've seen people who, in similar situations, all they do is go back and circle through conversations they wish they had or hadn't have. And the point of grieving is to be where you are, not to constantly drag yourself back into the past where God isn't. because God is only in the moment. So be there,
Yeah.
and then your, like I keep saying, but your soul will help you work through that process. I don't know.
Man, it's sort of hard to. I have a couple of different things. That was also good. I think even with both of these stories that come to mind, like a lot of it is exactly what you're describing. Just grieving well is allowing for grief to have its own course, to have a sort of unique course for you in the loss that you experience. So when I was at the VA, I was the trauma fellow. So most of the people all the people that I saw had PTSD. So there was just, and all of them, the particular clinic I was in was combat trauma. So everyone had either been in a situation where they thought they were going to die or that someone they knew passed away. And so I think there was something in the process that was really amazing with people that sort of made a lot of progress, which was somehow this experience that was super terrifying and super hard, and something that they had avoided. A lot of them, that's how they ended up seeing me. They had avoided for a long time, that by sort of week after week going into it again, making time for it again, slowly they began to be able to see different perspectives. And one of the more amazing things is slowly after continuing to go in, meaning was made from this experience. And there's just sort of this magic that happens when we engage with grief, where meaning can begin to sort of take place. So I think that's sort of thinking about walking through that with some of my veterans. I think the other thing, and I think this family's continued to do it well. I became very close with a mom and two daughters, and they're like family now. And daughters lost their dad. The mother lost her husband when he was relatively young. And so I think with them, this happened now. This is 2009, so this is 11 years later, 12 years later. And I would go over to the mom's house because the two kids were off at college 3 or 4 times a week. And so just seeing her share some of the funny things that she thought he had a perfect butt, which is hilarious. And also grieving this massive loss, talking with the daughters and them talking about how the dad used to wake them up by throwing Baby Ruths at them, as well as just the really sad moments of thinking about, one of them recently got married, the idea of their dad not being there. Exactly. And so these pieces that I think you said it really well earlier in terms of grieving, sometimes it's being able to laugh, sometimes it's being able to remember the things that are really awesome, and sometimes it's just crying and letting the tears flow. And so they continue to do that because there are always sort of more events that come up, particularly when a loss that's that big, that sort of bring back some of the sadness. Or an anniversary is another thing that tends to bring back a lot of emotion. And something I've been privileged to see them engage with it sort of time after time. So I don't know, those two things jump out.
Do you find that our evangelical, whatever that even means anymore, go to heaven when you die, better place, helps or hurts the process?
Man,
or is it too not that simplistic?
it's maybe not that simplistic. I think probably within, for being specific, sort of like the white evangelical church, it often is not helpful. Because the idea is joy, 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 joy. If we ever go to church on Sunday, what are we listening to? Celebration music. You have no reason to be sad because it's time to rejoice.
Well, and death is a blip. It's where, it's... As opposed to...
Or they're in a better place, or...
The grieving God who weeps at death, the difference. doesn't exist.
It's totally missed out. It's almost like parts of the Bible have just been ripped out. Like I love the idea. And you mentioned this with Lazarus this week. I love the idea that Jesus wept, knowing that he was going to resurrect Lazarus. Yeah. He already knew what he was going to do. He knew that Lazarus was going to be risen from the dead. So he knew that this wasn't the end for Lazarus. And yet he still took time to mourn Mary and Martha and to weep. And just the idea of that, like, so if Jesus knew that he was going to raise Lazarus, how for us can we know that we're going to see our family or loved ones again, but still make time now to mourn? And we just tend not to model that. We tend to, like you said, go to joy, 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 rejoice always.
And it's not a feigned mourning. Jesus isn't feigning the emotion. It's his, as you, I think, articulate. It's the most natural thing for him to do in the moment is to just be with his cousins and to see his best friend and grieve in this place. It's an incredible image. You said resurrection life itself, standing in a graveyard, mourning, knowing that he himself would be in the same state. But also mourning this, that there's more than utility to grief. It's part of being human. It's actually an essential aspect of what it means to be the image of God, to be a voice in a broken world that says this is not how it was meant to be. And to deny that actually denies something implicit in what the church is called to do. Because, if you've ever seen like older liturgies for, a funeral service or a memorial service, there really is, it's poems about the, death being nothing, just a moment. And it's like, that's not what we see in the New Testament. That's not the image of this God who weeps, who mourns, who grieves. And it's almost like we take death seriously at the cross, but we don't take it seriously any other time. And how do we relearn that? How do we honor? And I think part of it is the open-handedness, the control, I think. And the deaths of many types, the death of expectations, the death of a dream that we were so longed for. And COVID was the death in 1,000 ways. Yes, very serious and real deaths, but the death of the life that we expected, the wedding that never was, as you said, the father who couldn't be at the wedding. That's a death again. It's a death relived. And I think there is a tension because grief never heals, it just changes. Right, in some ways.
Well, that's why the language of closure
Yeah.
isn't helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Right? But
nothing closes off. You're right. Absolutely. I see what you're saying.
And it's not like it's a bleeding open wound all the time.
Yes.
It's just that there is a twinge every once in a while. Like I've December the 10th, every year, whether I'm aware of it or not, my body tells me this is the day your mom died.
Yeah.
And I will sometimes inadvertently go through part of the day and I just can't figure out why I'm down or why I'm sluggish or whatever. And then Jude reminds me, or my wife reminds me, this is the 10th. It's like, my soul is saying something happened on this day that was significant for us.
Yeah.
Don't pass over it. And it's not down in the dumps or whatever, but it is this moment that signals this is an ongoing thing, right? It's not close the door, move on. It's, no, this is part of the journey that we're on.
I was thinking about it too. Again, just going back to something that we've talked about before, which is just this idea of sort of we only allow Jesus in as far as we let him. The idea that in grief, if we do it, we get to experience God with us in a way that we never do otherwise. We get to experience God with us in our ugly, cry, in our weakness, in our tiredness, in our inability to control. We get to experience a God that's been there. We get to experience a God that can comfort and knows. We know that he felt the same grief. And that experience is one that I think can open our eyes, this is what it feels like, even when in the moment where maybe I feel most alone, that I'm not. Whether it's sort of feeling His Holy Spirit in the moment, or just feeling God's body in terms of His community being present. Yeah.
I wonder. No, please
I-
go ahead.
I do think to pick up on that, that this is a way of image, right? That if Paul's language is to fulfill, to complete the sufferings of Christ, this is at least one of the ways that we do that. That in our identification with His death, part of that isn't just about His crucifixion, but it's all of the deaths that He carried with Him to His crucifixion, which is to say, all of ours, right? And I think He trusts us in our losses to help Him, if I can use that language, carry those things. It's yesterday I was trying to get at this idea of its expansion of capacity for life, and there's only one way to expand that foundational reality, and that is through this kind of solidarity, I guess, with people in loss.
Yeah, I love that you gave this idea of sort of scooping out to create a deeper foundation. It was, great.
Yeah, that excavating
Yeah.
idea. That's beautiful. Yeah, what I was going to I wonder if our inability, and you triggered this when you said the word closure, because I think the purpose of closure from a psychological perspective is to prevent a stockpiling of negative experiences that go unprocessed, that then erupt when some minor or cataclysmic thing happens in our life, and then all of it bursts out in really unhealthy ways, and it's grown unhealthy. It's grown, I'm trying to think of the word, like infected. I wonder if there's our learned ability to tune into negative emotion every day actually trains us into grief better. I wonder how that, that's a thought I had as you were talking about closure, is that because we're so poor at tuning into the negative things that happen in our lives, or the negative conversations, as someone who works with couples a lot, the surefire way to create commitment and trust in a relationship is to have them tune into one another's negative emotions. The number one way to get them to have trust is, can you carry my negative emotions right now without reacting? But I'm not able to do that with my own life. Right? And so I become so ignorant to my own negative emotions, I could not possibly, and it's why I think community-wise, we are so poor at it, because, we say, I don't want to ask them about their husband or their wife or their loss, because it's going to bring up the pain. It's like, well, the pain is there. You talking about it isn't, it's just revealing what is there. And my question, I know that was a rambling point, but my question is, how do we do that well? How do we help people, and how do we become a safe place to ask questions, to ask the painful question, about the loss, and help someone grieve without being in control of it? Bill's got something.
Because over the years you hear dumb things Christians say, and you just think, oh man,
exactly.
Stupid things. Job's comforters.
Yes.
Just be silent, please.
Yes.
But the deep truth is, people want to talk about someone they've loved, and depending obviously on what the losses are, but it's simply, how are you doing? And the place where Job's friends got off track was trying to solve for a problem that they didn't understand. Right? They're
wanted
trying to
answers.
Provide a solution.
Yes.
And of course, they had vested interest. If something like this can happen to somebody like him, what can happen to us? I get it, but not helpful. So to be able to simply honor people's journey and say, how are you doing? Is there anything I can help you with? Do you need... And not everybody needs that, because sometimes we jump in without permission into relationships that we don't have. And so I think that there is a circle of care, but clearly if there can, and if I can not get in there and dig it out, but simply allow space for it to be expressed, I think that's a great gift in community.
Yeah, it's good. That's good.
One thing I was going to say is there's a tension I've experienced, and I just wanted to hear both of your thoughts on that. Some people do want to talk. Some people don't know in the disorientation that the disorientation is probably a good word for it, when they're really reeling from a significant loss, whether it be a huge identity loss from a firing of a job, which can be, as disrupting and devastating as a loss of a loved one. I've seen it tank people for decades, it's amazing what it can do, and the identity piece is so painful. And so that tension of, I've had friends where I'll reach out and say, hey, how can I be there? What do you want? Can we make a meal? And I just learned I'm just going to drop something off at the door and text and say, hey, I'm coming to drop this by. And I've learned that, at first I was like, is that too imposing? But I'm still giving them the gap. They don't have to come and talk to me. And that's what I was going to ask, is where's that balance of helping someone but not being the codependent who has, I have to fix you because I want to fix myself.
Yeah, such a big part of this is what is our expectation as the helper. Yeah. Because sometimes we come in and we're like, all right, like you said, we got to control, we got to fix it, got to solve it, got to do something. You feel bad. I don't like you feeling bad. How can I get you out of this? Yeah, right. And we keep coming back to space, but being willing to sit with someone in a space without having to do anything. It's so hard for us in our culture because we are constantly trying to do something. But just
everything,
being able to be present. Just being able to say, this has come up a lot. For me, came up last June after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Ahmaud Arbery came up again. Recently with Dante Wright, where I'll have friends that at times like, well, what do we do about this? And I don't know. They'll sort of be asking for things because they want to solve the problem or they want to be able to help. And in that moment, really, what's necessary, what's helpful is saying, "Hey, I just see you, and I know that this might be hard. I'm just here." No expectation. You don't need to respond. You need not ever respond. Just know that I'm here and I love you. And that, because I'm usually not going to respond. But just for me to know, oh, you see me. Yeah. You acknowledge what's going on. Yeah. And I think I was talking about the experience with this family. I think. A lot of what sort of how our relationship built and sort of the privilege that I had was because I was just there consistently and didn't sort of ever push or try to solve. But I was present, and when anniversaries come up, when things come up, I'd say, hey, I don't know how you might be feeling, but if you'd like to talk about it, you can talk with me. Yeah. And so I think that gets at some of this. And it's, we've talked in the past, it's sort of been like a tagline for us to be countercultural, but this is pretty countercultural to just be able to sit with people in the space without trying to change it. Yeah. And come with that expectation.
And just to communicate is, I'm thinking about you. Yeah. If you want to touch base, great. If you don't, no worries. Yeah. Because that's my pastoral approach when I've walked with people through deaths, right? Yeah. I will be in touch. I tend to back off between the loss, the death itself and the funeral, because you've got family and you've got all of the things. If they need me to hold their hand at the cemetery or at the mortuary or whatever, I'll do that. But it's when people go home that now I need to step it up. So I will call pretty much every day for 2 or 3 weeks, and then it'll be once a week, and then it'll be once a month. Yeah. I know when the anniversaries are, I know when the birthdays are, and I'll call on those. Sometimes I'll drop by, but it's just touch points. It's not I'm here to solve. It's not, I finally figured out the why.
Yeah.
It's just the human community, the touch points are really all and the most necessary, because again, I don't know how your soul grieves.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to create some space to allow your soul to grieve in unique ways that is appropriate to you, and protect that space as best I can, and support then the work of the Spirit in that excavating what might God be doing in this moment that we don't want to miss, and that becomes more helpful than trying to do anything else. And sometimes just very practically, I think partly because of the pastoral role, but sometimes the guy died and somebody needs to fix the plumbing.
Yes.
And so I'll go over and fix the plumbing, or, pick up the groceries, or we need some help picking the kids up. We forgot to schedule. We don't know how to do this. Okay, let's just the practical stuff.
Yeah, I think the piece that you said about like following up, I think that really does show genuine care. Is for a lot of people when it's a loss, when it's a big loss, it's when they start going back to work, grieving isn't over, right? Like when they, like if they have kids, they are having to move along. Grieving isn't over, and so knowing 2 months, 6 months, 10 years, I think if we want to be a community that cares and steps in and partners in grieving, then part of that is continuing to check in, continuing to again acknowledge that we're ready and willing to just be present if ever needed,
and to meet a need if you're aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wonder if you said it, like, I don't know how your soul grieves, and one of the difficulties is so many of us only learn about our soul in these moments because of how inattentive we are to the negative. It's like we're running a marathon, we haven't trained for it. Now all of a sudden our soul's in a deep work of pain and grief and loss, and all of a sudden we're having to do the background work. So even what practically, if grief is inevitably a part of what we do, what I heard you said, which I thought was thoughtful, that I thought was really interesting, was can I just be present? It's almost like the definition of mindfulness, like learning to be present without wishing it was otherwise, which is I use the language of prayerfulness, which just in the same biblical sense. But what are things we can do every day to prepare ourselves for the stretching that comes? And obviously we can't anticipate, but we know loss is very much a part of life, and both in death and in...
Well, and that's the solution, isn't it? Be present to the losses. Don't medicate, don't run, don't hide, don't deny. Just be there. You lost the job. That sucks. Sit in that moment. Let it hurt. Don't blow yourself up at the bar. Just be there. Lean into the pain.
Don't just say it was just a job. Let it be what it was.
No.
Don't just say it was just a job.
She broke up with me.
Let it be what it was.
No. That didn't. I got the job, and it just is life draining. Okay, sit in where you are, and don't deny the response to the real. And your soul, again, because we are experiencing loss on loss on loss regularly, the soul builds up capacity if we let it. But when we deny it, when we medicate it, when we don't lean into the pain, when something significant occurs, we have nothing to draw on.
I think there's, and this is some of what you were saying too, Brian, but just this like ability to be mindfully emotionally aware, which is to me like being able to be present without being judgmental about what's going on internally for us. I think with that there's this idea, and this is something that we've been talking about, but this idea of I think we've created this idea that some emotions are bad and other emotions are good.
That's really good.
And being able to flip that a bit can be really helpful. Like Sadness is actually letting us know we need to take a break. We need to rest.
Yeah.
There's something that we need to recoup our resources, or there's something that we need to honor and process through. Anger might be a boundary has been crossed, or something unfair has happened to us or somebody else. That's a good thing to be able to recognize. Anxiety might be something that appropriately prepares us for something that's coming up. And so but we flip those things to be like, well, they don't feel very good, so they must be terrible, and we have to push them away. And so in terms of practical things, some of it is recognizing, hey, these emotions that we call negative emotions because they don't feel as great, they're not actually bad things.
Yeah.
They're actually really
They're not morally bad.
They're not morally
yeah,
bad.
totally. Interesting.
They're
That's
not
great.
morally bad. And this idea, if we, this is always one of the interesting things. Clinically, I'll find people that they come in and they're like, I'm numb. I just don't really experience very much emotion. And then I find that they've been avoiding all the negative emotions.
Yeah.
And so when you avoid all the negative, you don't get the positive.
Yeah.
It really has to be both sides. And so I think practically there's the opportunity, like Bill was saying, of noticing when things come up, how does it feel? How do I feel physically?
Yeah.
What kind of thoughts come through? What do I end up doing? Because that can tune us in when we do have loss to be like, oh, I've experienced sadness before. Maybe this is sadness, 10x a lot. It's a lot more. But I also know that because of my past experiences of sadness, I know this too will pass.
Yeah.
I know there's a natural course to most emotions. So I don't need to run away from this. There's something that I can learn from this emotional experience. So we can do that sort of as we go along, as we do life.
What I'm hearing, what I love is just you're giving freedom to experience the spectrum of loss and grief, as not all grief and loss are equal, and they're not, but they're also not to be compared, in the sense that to say the loss of a dog, I hear people do that, well, it's not as bad as mine, and it becomes this comparison game and how unhelpful that is. But it's also about just in one's soul, what's the spectrum of loss? For you, the job didn't mean much. For another person, it was life devastating. And so I wonder if there's, maybe you have language for this, it's the physical loss of a person or a job because you're removed from them. You also have to grieve the internal identity loss of whatever relationship that produced in change of your identity. And if it was a job or if it was a spouse, there's a real identity loss of who am I apart from this? Will I ever weigh as much again without this person in the world? Will I ever weigh as much without this title attached to me? And then I think that could lead people so quickly into this disenchantment, this sense of, it was never, either it was better than I thought it was, or it was never as good as I thought. Was I even as good as I thought? And I think that's where the Job conversation comes in, when you're left after all of those things. Is this world as I thought it was? Is God as I thought it? How do you care for people in the midst of that, where real loss has precipitated a real deep question for, is this
for
the
me,
world?
again, that's the gift of it. Of course it wasn't the way you thought it was going to be.
Totally.
Of course your expectations were wrong. You're standing on just a narrow slice of eternity and projecting out. Of course you're going to. So take advantage of the correctives that reality gives you to open up, expand. The challenge will be, if you're terrified, if change is threatening, if you're not anchored in your beauty and belovedness as the precious son and daughter of God, then anything that comes in is threat. And I'm suggesting that we're not smart enough in any real time to have a solution, to even be able to evaluate whether something's good or bad. Of course, the losses of a loved one, or but it's not all one or the other. I mean, there are answers, like we've talked about, answers to prayer that I'm just so grateful now that prayer was answered with a no,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That I didn't get what I wanted, or that I lost what I had.
Yeah.
You know, I just have come to realize if I need to do that in real time, not just retrospectively.
Totally.
I need to let my life happen, receive it all with thanksgiving, offer it up, and let God do what He's able and capable of doing in and through all of it, you know?
Yeah.
Would you say that to someone in the midst of, how would you say that, and I'm sure you're probably very similarly, to someone spiraling in the midst of a doubt or a deep...
For those folks, there are ways of saying that, namely to say you're not alone,
Yeah.
I'm with you, God's with you.
Yeah.
The passage that we looked at, the cross, if nothing else, at the depth of your being, you have a Savior who knows exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
And can be with you in it. It's not about theodicy. It's not trying to explain the why, because there is no why.
The science of it, right? Job's friends.
No, it just doesn't work that way. But it is, you're accompanied. I don't know what God is up to in this. He wasn't up to anything going in, but I'm convinced His goodness is at work coming out.
Yes.
Let's not operate any heavy equipment here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea that like God's big enough for that doubt, like we see it throughout the Psalms, like he's big enough for it, and so we don't have to make God any bigger. We don't have to say this is what God would say. It's just like I think Bill said, well, hey, He's here now, and I'm also here now. If it's in a relationship, and we can continue to walk through this devastating experience, because I think there is an opportunity whenever our identity is changed or crushed to maybe learn a more true identity.
Yes.
But that takes molding and sharpening, and those things are not comfortable when we feel like we're fully formed.
Well, and I think too, part of the spiraling that you have alluded to arises out of our arrogance.
Yes.
That we think everything needs to make sense to us.
Yeah.
That's part of the knowledge of good and evil that we're just not built for.
Yeah.
You know, we're parachuted down into the middle of the play, and it's been going on for a while.
Yeah.
And we got to figure out what our part is, play it as well as we can, and then get our exit line right.
Yeah.
So I'm humility, boy, I'll tell you.
Well, I have a question that resonates, but you just made me think of this. I looked into this because I was curious after your message yesterday, Bill, that the name Cain, I was curious about the first mother and her relationship to her child Cain, which comes from their word acquire, his name. And it literally, from the definition of the first mother's declaration at the birth of their son was, I have acquired a man. The language is possession. And I just thought of the first time we think of that relationship as ownership. It's I, like, as opposed to the gift, I've received the gift of this child to steward and care for. And how if we are too busy doing that, Bill, as you have said, to grasping on to this relationship, if it's the loss of a life, as opposed to opening our hands, from the moment that precious relationship was born, it was born with the seeds of that betrayal. And that's painful, but it's like, so then the gift in all of this is we are not in control.
Right.
And this relationship, sacred and holy and so unique and precious, is not mine to own.
Right.
And that open-handedness provides the space that we've been talking about, painful as it is, but if we do that well, then grief becomes a little easier in some ways. This was a question that I think, please.
I think just there's sort of two messages in that. To the person that's not grieving right now,
Yes.
one, grief is coming. Two, you have less control than you think.
Yes.
Three,
exactly
your
that.
view of who God is and what your identity is 100% is going to change between now and when you go to see him.
Yeah.
So like, can we build that paradigm for ourselves leading up to grief? And the second message is for the person that's grieving, is to say, in the midst of this grief and what feels really terrible, I'm not going to give you an answer.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try and explain it away. I'm not going to say you have to have a smile on your face when you come to Sunday. But I will say you have a God that knows the grief you're experiencing and is willing to sit with you. And this is a community that we want to be one that we can sit there with you too. Because I think it's so important to make that specific, because sometimes you can be like, that first message, we can give that message, we can go, oh, okay, that's our message now for when people are grieving, and we turn it into Job's friends.
Yes.
And so
That's a very thoughtful clarification. Thank you. Yeah, even the way I said that, I realized sounds so clinical, and I didn't mean it that way. Yours was far more pastoral and empathetic. Thank you, Hector.
it's good. It's good.
We only have a few more questions, but one thing that someone asked that I thought came up when you were talking, both of you just now, is how as a friend or as someone in a community, care for someone who has been in an ongoing, maybe consistent, not spiral, but pattern where every few years, we have a question here, I'll just read it, but walking with someone who's experiencing deep levels of debilitating grief that stems from a loss from many years ago. We've talked about kind of grief resurfacing at other things, but how do we slow down enough, and how do we be friends for people who are really stuck in this long pattern of grief being debilitating even over time? What would you, I mean, it's a lot of things we've said, but anything else that comes to mind for that specific instance?
You have a thought, Bill?
Well, again, not to be redundant, but you have to be where you are. And there are people whose life has continually dealt them what all intents and purposes feels like a losing hand. And the disciples' question is, okay, how would Jesus do this if he were me? And I don't know with specificity, but the short way to get at that for me is, well, Jesus would be there in all of the losses and let them be what they are without connecting the dots into meaningful meaninglessness. So it's okay. I'm walking with somebody right now whose chronic illness is persistent and debilitating. And the other day, we finally came to the awareness, is it possible that your energy and effort to try and find out the why is prohibiting you from just being present in the pain? Is it possible that maybe your job as a disciple of Jesus right now is to just do this as well as you can, and not try and fix it? And that, for whatever reason, landed in a way that was helpful and let some air into the system. And I think that it's similar to folks that are undergoing those kind of dynamics.
I mean, and a lot of it, not much to add. I think, I think we talked about this a little bit before, but sometimes when we are the friend or the partner, we struggle to be able to sit with other people's emotions, be able to sit with other people's grief. And so part of that may be for this person to be able to work on being able to sit in that grief and share it with God and say, hey, this is a burden where I need you to sort of take with me. And I think, like you said, Bill, we can't minimize how healing it can be to just be there. And so just continuing to be there through each season whether the person is not able to see it or is not able to see it in the moment or not, can be a reminder of who Jesus is in the midst of their debilitating grief. And so in terms of like, what do you do? Keep showing up.
Yeah.
Don't try and change them. Just keep loving them.
Yeah. That's helpful. Yeah. You know, we haven't outlined the stages of grief as they're often but I mean, this has been long articulated. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance are typically cited as the kind of 5 primary stages, and they cycle through. It's not like a linear thing, as in most things. But particularly when I think of long-term grief and I think of lingering depression associated with grief, my experience, both personally and with people and friends, that I've seen helpful is just very small, tangible steps, just like you would if you were in a long depression, where like if you can't get out of bed but 11 o'clock every day, well, try 10:45. You know, Parker Palmer was really helpful for me in this and some of my own stuff in years past, where he suffered, a great writer, but writes very honestly about his experience of depression. And I think if we think of grief in those overindulgent, you know, too much into the pain and grief all day versus total avoidance. What I've tended to be pastorally, maybe this isn't even helpful, but I feel like for me this has been helpful with people is to, okay, if you can't even endure the pain for a minute, I'm gonna ask you just for 5 minutes, set a timer, just reflect on the loss of your, you know, of the person. So at least you're not avoiding it if you need that, if that's helpful. And then on the other end, if you're in bed 8 hours a day because of this loss, do one thing tomorrow. Go for one walk for 10 minutes. That's helpful for you, you know? And it's almost like those little milestones in the midst of what feels like a deep depression or hard time. Those little tiny movements of health that just feel like, okay, I am not in control, but I'm not out of control, where I am not just fully washed in it. And I don't know if that's helpful. I don't know if you probably have a better phrase or way of thinking about it, but those have just been little tools I've learned over the years.
No, I think that's right on. Like the psychological term is like behavioral activation, but all that means is when you're depressed, you really don't want to do anything. And even though it's counterintuitive, an aspect of getting out of feeling super depressed is doing something. And so it can be doing anything. So like you said, whether it's waking up 15 minutes earlier, or it's doing one more task than you did the day before, or it's finding things. Often when we feel really low, we lose joy in things that we previously enjoyed. But we just don't have the same energy for it. Trying to incorporate one of those things back in. Maybe we really enjoyed reading, or we really enjoyed going to a coffee shop. I think we can sometimes get stuck in being like, I need to change my whole life experience right now. So we go super hard for a day and then we just crash and we're right back where we started. So I think those baby steps, setting goals, in just really incremental ways can be helpful for moving us out of that sort of nadir, that sort of rock bottom spot.
That's really helpful. I think that's even helpful to end on something that's really practical for people who might be really in the midst of it. I appreciate that very much. Before we close, is there anything we missed that you feel lingering in your head from our conversation that you want to leave with people? Any thoughts?
I think one thing that came to mind is sometimes we don't really know that we're grieving. And something that I think a lot of people experienced probably at the beginning of quarantine and maybe continue to experience is we started binging Netflix a lot more, and we started drinking, instead of one glass of wine, 2, or a bottle, sure. Or we ate a lot less, or we ate a lot more, or we stopped engaging with people. We isolated more.
Yeah.
I think those can be, if we're like, well, I'm not grieving anything. There's nothing that I lost over quarantine.
Yeah.
Work went well. I made money. So, what do I have to grieve? Maybe reflecting again on some of that, because for a lot of us, there were losses that were there in one way or another, and maybe noticing, maybe I did something a little bit more often than I usually do. Yeah. Maybe I engaged in something, or I gave myself permission to do something that wasn't really healthy, and really, that was my way of grieving, without really actually touching on what I was experiencing. So, I think there's probably space for that for a lot of us that we, even a year later, still haven't really acknowledged. Yeah. That was one thing that came to mind.
Yeah, for me, I think it was similar to that, but is the regular check-in with yourself. I use the language of a dashboard to take the two primary emotions and the three protector emotions, and just see how am I doing with love and joy, and then with fear, sadness, and anger, and just invite the Spirit on every couple or 3 days at the least, maybe more often, to circle back and examine and say, is love and joy, are those tanks full? Am I coming out of a full place, or is there, am I hitting the sandbars because there's not enough water in the channel, right? And then as I think back over fear or anger or sadness, and you can use others, but those three have been helpful to me. How am I doing at each of those? Am I giving myself permission to be sad or to be angry, or to at least get angry without being angry, or to recognize that, no, I don't want to not be afraid if something's a threat. I want to learn how to so any of those learnings. And then the second piece, which ties into that, is that's then how we allow losses and limitations to be the seedbed of new, to be the fountainhead of new possibilities that were not open to us. I just think of this crazy story of a guy in last century plowing his field, seeing the big rock in the field, plowing around it year after year, century after century. It's been the family's land, and they've just plowed around the rock. And one day he just decided, I'm going to get this rock out of here. And when he took the rock off, he discovered it was the capstone on a building that had been buried underground for centuries. It was the library in Ugarit. And he, pulling this capstone off, all of a sudden there's something, and they'd just been plowing around it.
That's incredible.
Year after year, generation after generation. And I think grief is saying, well, what if there's some possibility that's opening up that I hadn't previously imagined? So even this pandemic, I've used this with you guys before, but this is the Hebrew tohu vabohu, the formlessness and void. This is the emptiness. This is the chaos. This is the confusion. And the Spirit is brooding over that loss, over those limitations. And the Word of God comes into that space, and new life springs forth. But we're not able to receive that if we're clinging so desperately to what was,
That's a great word to end on. If I said anything, I'd probably mess up that perfect ending. And I just am so grateful that our community has both of you in it, and that you get to speak regularly into the life of our community personally, obviously from teaching, but also just the wisdom that you both bring in your lived experience, as well as the experience you have in your jobs and your training. And I am just so grateful personally that we get to learn from you and to walk with you and to constantly learn. And I'm looking forward to more conversations like this with you, Hector. and I've been so grateful for what you've been, someone who's helped been a friend in grief for me over the years, Bill. And just as we end, I just want to say, let this be the beginning of a conversation. This is the start of, we by no means have all the answers, and I hope that was clear from the start. But I do just want to encourage you, as we've said here, make space for where you're at. Let yourself find a freedom to let God be the safest place for you to cry, to lament, and then for this community to be a place that is whole, that can hold and carry you in the midst of wherever you're at. And you get to do that as a part of this community with other people. And that's why we do this as family, because to do this alone is to be missing the point. And we're just so grateful that we live in a community that wants to press into these conversations. We do not run from these conversations. We don't want to linger. As Bill said, we don't turn every stone over at every point, but we want to let our souls find the space to be where they're at. So thank you guys so much for being here. I had no idea how this was going to go in what directions, but I've been so personally grateful for it. I feel like I'm leaving with some personal work to do, as well as some things to be very grateful for. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah.
See you guys soon. Thanks.
For the opportunity.
Bye.